text this morning comes from Mark's Gospel, chapter 5, beginning with verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. And now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but instead grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." And immediately the hemorrhage stopped. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and in trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The word of God for you, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. Lord, come to us this morning and fill our hearts, our minds, and our souls with your presence. May these human words spoken and heard become your words, and thus spiritual food for us. For we ask it through your Son's name. Amen. I hope that was a commercial for tonight or this afternoon. That's great. More to come. There we go. You're looking good for this 4th of July weekend. Yeah, you look really good. You didn't have any place to go? Okay. Well, we're glad you're here. Okay. Many years ago, while Gail and I were serving in Spartanburg County, the body of a young migrant worker was discovered in a peach grove. It was a child of a migrant who had been in that system of migration all of his life, from Florida to Virginia, picking strawberries, tomatoes, peaches, cabbages, pulling potatoes. You understand. When the coroner went to the body, he examined the body and then began to look for personal things on him. And in the shirt pocket, he found a note that explained the death. It was a suicide. And the note simply read, "I always wanted to be a somebody, but I'm just a nobody." Have you ever been there? Now, I'm not talking about on the point of suicide, but have you ever felt like you were a nobody? Maybe it was because you were driving a 1960 Ford Falcon and everybody else had a BMW. Or their shirts had little alligators on them and you got yours at the bottom dollar. You know, you feel worthless, insignificant, unwanted, despised, devoid of any value. Now, I'm not talking about the feeling of being cheap. Feeling cheap implies that there is some value. You're just cheap. What I'm talking about is feeling as though you're completely devoid of any value at all. No, I'm talking about feeling worthless. Having absolutely no intrinsic value at all as a human being. In our consumer materialistic world, that is easy. For there is little, if any, interest in worthless things in our culture, in our society, especially among people. Now, you've heard me say it before, but I think it bears repeating. The real problem for all of this goes all the way back to our primordial parents in the Garden of Eden. You know, God puts them in a perfect place, gives them all that they need, tells them all is theirs, except one thing. One thing. He says, that tree is mine, and you can't have of it. But that shadowy figure comes slurking into the scene and whispers in our primordial mother's ear, "Psst, psst, you don't have everything you need. You're short of something. You're devoid of something. God didn't give it all to you. You need to grab it and get it." Well, therein lies disobedience. Sin is disobedience, isn't it? And because she wanted something she thought she didn't have, she disobeyed the holy. And the original sin continues because we do it every day. We continue that act of disobedience in our lives from beginning to end. Now let me ask you a question. And I hope you don't think of it just as a rhetorical question. I want to ask you a serious question, a question that you will have your soul answer. It's a question in which determines the quality of our life. It's a question which determines the nature of our soul. It's also a question that has eternal consequences. Who are you? Who are you? Let me ask it one more time. Who are you? Well, my guess is some of you thought along those familiar lines, like I would say, well, I'm Buddy, I'm Gail's husband, I am the father of Nancy and Tyler, I'm the grandparent of Ainsley and Hudson. But that's what I am. It's not who I am. Well, I could go on and say, oh, well, you know, I'm the senior pastor at First United Methodist Church, and go on and on from that. But again, that's what I am. That's not who I am. Who are you? Well, you could respond, well, I'm a carpenter, I'm a mechanic, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a teacher. On and on and on. But again, I'm going to ask the boring question now. Who are you? And stop answering it with all the whats. Who are you? Well, I'm an optimist. I'm a pessimist. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. I'm young. I'm old. I don't eat grits. Still, all that's what's. That's not the who. You still have not answered the question. Maybe the reason we find it so difficult to answer that question is that we do not know who we are, because we have associated who we are with what we have and what we do and where we've been and the prestige we hold and the degrees we hang on our wall, where we graduated, where we were born, the type of car we drive, the kind of house we live in, the water we live on. It's got to be deep water too. You know, it can't be shallow water, it's got to be deep water. Of all the passages in the New Testament, I think this text before us this morning is one of my top three. Because when I read it, I still get goosebumps about the implications it holds for us. I like the quick action. I love the sheer raw faith. I enjoy seeing the unmitigated compassion of Christ towards these two people in the story. And I also believe we could just grasp the implication of this story. It would change us fundamentally, change our souls. It would change how we deal with society or with our culture. It would help us emotionally and spiritually. I think if we could really allow the meaning of this text to feed our souls, it would quench that that terrible thirst you and I have. You know, that thirst we drink and we're just as thirsty after we get through. And that hunger when we gorge ourselves and when we wipe our mouths with a napkin, we're still hungry. You know the thirst and the hunger I'm really talking about, don't you? Well, let's look at Jesus. He's just gotten off the boat, so to speak. Just gotten off the boat. Remember that terrible storm he was in last week and everybody was fussing at him because he was asleep? Well, he's just gotten off that boat now. He's gone from the west side to the east side. He's gone from the Judaistic side of Galilee, and now he's on the Gentile side of Galilee. And he's walking along, and this somebody comes into the story, and his name is Jairus. And he comes to Jesus as a last resort. He falls down on his knees in front of Jesus and begins to beg him. His daughter is dying. His daughter is dying. And like any good parent, he wants to do what he can to save her. Jairus is president of the local synagogue, which means he's a leader of society. He's a leader of that culture. He's a leader of that religion. He's at the center of his society. He is a real somebody. And I think it was a last resort because he's risking all that he is, socially, culturally, and religiously, to go to Jesus, who was despised by the Jewish authorities. He goes to Jesus as a last resort and falls on his knees and asks for his daughter's healing. I imagine he's probably already visited physicians and faith healers, but he comes to Jesus for his child's sake. This somebody, in other words, is willing to become a nobody for the expense of his daughter's life. So he goes. And while Jesus is walking with this somebody back to his house where the daughter is ill, a nobody enters the scene. A nobody. It's a woman. I'm sorry, but it's a woman, and in that society, in that culture, in that religion, women had no value whatsoever except what you could do for the family. Birth a baby, feed a child, teach a child up to about 11, 12 years old. I mean, you were described as a piece of property or a field. You're barren. You know, barren is what soil is like, right? Yeah. So she had no value, no real worth in that society. And on top of that, she's not just a woman who is worthless, she's a diseased woman. You can't get any worse than that. She's diseased. She's had this disease for 12 years. She spent all of her money trying to get fixed. And she's just as bad this day as she was when she first began seeking treatment. And she hears about Jesus as well, this nobody. And she wants to go and get healed. Picture, if you will, you know, she's probably unkept. Her hair is greasy and stringy. There's nobody with her. Nobody would have anything to do with her. You know, the disease she had, she could not allow her shadow to intermingle with anybody else's shadow because her shadow would make them unclean. So she's an untouchable. And she can't touch either. But she goes. It's probably the last resort. But she goes. And she thinks to herself, all I have to do is reach in there and touch the hem of his garment. And it will be enough. I'll be healed. Now, what she's reaching to touch is the robe of Jesus and the prayer shawl of Jesus. You know, with Jewish male, carried their prayer shawl around their shoulders, and when they went into prayer, they would pull the shawl over their head. Now, not only that, there's a little tassel that hangs on the side of the shawl, and that shows the authority of the rabbi or the one in prayer. And I think that's what she's reaching for. I think she's reaching for his tassel. Reaching for the tassel. And she knows in her heart, in her mind, in her soul, that all she has to do is touch the authority of this Galilean carpenter who is able to stop wind and storms, who can raise the dead, who can make blind eyes see, can open ears that cannot hear, can loosen a tongue. All I have to do is just reach in there. And I touch that tassel, that authority, then I will be healed as well. What faith? What faith? She is a nobody because of her disease. And she knows if she is healed, she will become a somebody once again. So this somebody walks along with Jesus to see the somebody's daughter who is ill. A nobody who is also sick comes along, and she has been sick as long as Jairus' daughter has been in the world. Isn't that remarkable? So a somebody and a nobody are walking along, and Jesus is in the middle of that song. He bridges the gap between this somebody and this nobody. Now, we all have had seasons in life when we felt useless, I think, and worthless. It may have been when we were very young. It may have been when we've grown old. It may have been when we are stuck in the same vocation, the same job for years and couldn't move up. Oftentimes moved out. It could have been when we retired. You know, when you do the same thing for years upon years, you associate who you are with what you've done, and then when you retire, then you don't have that connection, that social, cultural, maybe even spiritual connection any longer once you have retired. So you feel like you've lost a part of self. And this is why it's so critical for people to be able to describe who they are apart from what they do. Because when you lose the clothes, you lose the house, you lose the car, you lose the checking account or the CDs, the bank account. When you lose all that, then what has happened? You have lost yourself. You've lost yourself. On October the 24th, 1929, what happened? Stock market. Yeah, Black Thursday. It was the highest rated day of suicide in the United States. Did you know that? People all over the United States committed suicide. Jumped out of windows. Took pills. Shot themselves. And you can go back and look at the economy of the United States, and it peaks just like that. When there's a sudden crash, suicide rates increase. During the oil crisis in the 70s, guess what happened? Suicide rates increased. And then we had the double dip recession in the 80s. Guess what happened? The suicide rates increased. Then we had the Great Recession recently. Guess what happened? The suicide rates increased. And that tells me at least there are a lot of people in our society, in our culture, who have tied who they are with what they have. And when they lose what they have lost who they are. And that's tragic. Watch that nobody in our text this morning, this worthless person trying to wiggle through that crowd of people. It's a sheer act of desperation, but when you're desperate, you'll do anything, won't you? Now, here's a little thing about her. If she is caught touching these clean people, making them unclean, that's a capital offense. They could simply withdraw from her and pick up stones and execute her immediately. Stone her to death. But she's willing to reach in there to get healed. get cured. The unclean were forbidden to touch the clean, and the clean were forbidden to touch the unclean. But she thinks, if I can just touch it. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. Go ahead. Nobody's going to steal your pocketbook or your billfold. Go ahead. I'm watching. I won't let them. See her. She's exhausted. She's unkempt. She's thin, wasted away. Her clothes are torn, dirty. Her feet are calloused from all the miles she's walked without shoes. She has no pride. She has no dignity. She may have a shawl pulled over her head. And with that trembling hand, she reaches out and she touches what she sought for 12 years. And she's instantly healed. But that's not the end of the story. There's much more. Now you can open your eyes for the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. Notice what happens next. Jesus knows how we don't know. Jesus senses something has happened. He realizes he's been touched and something has passed from him to her. And he wants to know who it was. He turns around and he says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples think he's lost his mind. What do you mean, who touched me? Look at this crowd of people. Jesus, it could have been anybody. No, well, not with Jesus. Jesus says, no, it's not just anybody. It was a somebody that touched me. Somebody touched me. Now, Jairus probably thought it was a nobody that touched him. But Jesus says, no, it was a somebody. And when this woman realizes what's going on in the conversation, she doesn't run away. She doesn't run away. She, like Jairus, falls at Jesus' feet and says, "Here I am. I'm the one that touched you. I am the unclean spirit that reached out and touched you, but I'm healed." And Jesus is so taken emotionally and spiritually with the faith of this nobody who was really a somebody all along. And he says, "Your faith has made you well. Go. Go." But the real goosebump thing, the real thing in this story that gives me goosebumps is none of that. What gives me goosebumps is what he calls her. Remember now, the disciples think it could have been anybody. The religious authorities, including Jairus, probably thought it was a nobody. Jesus knew it was somebody, and guess what he does? He calls her daughter. Read the story again. He's not going to let her remain a nobody. He calls her daughter. He adopts her. He adopts her. She is somebody. There's a world out there just beyond these walls, filled with many people who feel just like that broken woman of old. Some of you may feel like that, but the world out there feels the same way. They are buying and getting and going and trying to fill their emotional bank account with material stuff and cultural events, and they don't know who they are. They know what they are. They know what they're not. But they don't know who they are. Some of them are unhealthy. Some of them feel like castaways on a sea of humanity. Some live in trailers. Some ride the bus and ignored by most people in most places. Some are young enough to skip rope. Some are so old they can't hold the rope. Many feel unwanted. But they really are somebody. And they don't know it. So we need to tell them. We need to tell them. They are somebody. Now, I shared a autobiographical article by a homeless person in Australia, and it was a beautiful article, and it told his story, and at the end he says, you know what we homeless need the most? What do you think he would say? Food? Shelter? No. Medicine? No. A cell phone? No. You know what he said they needed the most? To be seen. To be seen. He begged for people not just to look through him anymore, to see him as a human being, to see him as a person. And you know, when we see somebody, when we really see them, we're recognizing their humanity. We're saying to them, you are somebody. You're worth to be seen. You're worthy of my sight. There are no castaways. Our real worth doesn't come to us by way of what we own, the prestige we command, or the social status we enjoy, or the caliber of our friends and our relatives. Real worth and human value, you see, comes from the holy. And the holy says to us, you are my son. You are my daughter. None of that other stuff matters. That's just what you do. That's not who you are. I want you to repeat after me. Please, entertain me for just a second. Say out loud, I am somebody.
I am somebody.
Do it again.
I am somebody.
One more time.
I am somebody.
Now turn to your left, because you're somebody. Now turn to your left and say, you are somebody.
You are somebody.
Now turn to your right. Now, some of you won't have anybody on your right. Say it anyway. Turn to your right. Now look in front of you. You are somebody. Turn around and look behind you. We are. We are. Because we belong to Christ. They are. They are. Because they also belong to Christ. Now that you recognize the fact that you are somebody, listen to the words of the mystic Teresa of Avila. Christ has no other hands but your hands to do his work today. No other feet but your feet to guide folk along his way. No other lips but our lips to tell them why he died. No other love but your love to win them to his side. You are somebody. Go proclaim that and share it with others who feel they are nobody. Amen.